Good. Welcome to everybody. Today is a very special day for the department because the Larry Epstein Lecture is probably the most important thing that we organize because we really appreciate and remember a lot Larry. And I am very happy that we have so much people here from all over the world, many colleagues and many old friends. Also, we will give a very remembrance to everybody that is coming, all alumni, and sometimes we forget our alumni that are all over the world, and I'm very happy to have here the alumni of the department. And it's a celebration of Larry Epstein. This morning I was checking in Google Scholar how many citations has Larry Epstein, and he has 2,600 citations. This means that in fact he's strongly alive. He's very important still for the profession. His contributions are very important, and we really appreciate him a lot. And he's still on one of the essentials of the economic history. This lecture, we ever organized this lecture to celebrate the new young scholars in the profession, the new people that are arriving to the profession. It's very interesting when I look the list of people that we invite. Practically everybody's already professor. This means that it's a good signal. If you are invited to the Larry Epstein Lecture, you can become professor. Some people immediately, when we invite, like Mohamed Saleh, he was invited as associate professor and arrived here like full professor. Previous people that has come here, Regina Grafe, that is a student of Larry. She made the first one. And we have another very important people that we have come previously, Mohamed Saleh. In the last years, Mohamed Saleh, Marcela Alston, that is co-author of Marianne, Mark Koyama, or Kerstin Eflon, for example. Okay. Now I will introduce Marianne very shortly, and later I will make some very short statement how we will organize this, because we have a lot of people, obviously. Okay. We are very happy to have here Marianne Wanamaker, that is Associate Professor of Economics at the University of Tennessee. Also is a Research Associate at the MBR, Research Fellow of ISA, and the University of St. Stellenbosch in South Africa. Okay, he is already editor of the Explorations in Economic History. I feel bad because I am the competition, but I am happy that she's editor of the Explorations, and she probably will be the main editor in few time. And also she has been chief domestic economist of the White House Council of Economic Advisors. It's very difficult to explain everything that she has already done, even she's very young, but she has made very nice contribution. I only will talk about two, I think, very important papers that I'm sure that several of my colleagues use already in teaching. One is the paper that she published with Marcela in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, where she studied the impact that has the Tunstein study. That, for the people who don't know, is this study that they conduct in Black people, and they don't give medication, and this produced that these people pass completely the illness, and this was discovered in the United States, I think in the 1970s. And this has a huge impact on the appreciation of the minorities against the treatment of the government and so on. If you want, and this is so important now, if you read the newspapers in England now, and it's plenty of news about the minorities don't want, if you ask to the people, how many people don't want to take COVID vaccine, the group that less want to take any measure is the Black people in England. This means that it's really important. It's something, and I talk with some of my friends and they say, yes, I don't have full confidence on the government. I don't have full confidence in the doctors. This paper is strongly important because show that this has some very important historical base, and also is paper I think is very actual. And later I will talk, among other things, with his two papers with Bill Collins about Black migration. That is another topic that is very important. How much the people can benefit from migration, how important is migration, and how this can change the situation of minorities that are discriminated in some parts of the country, okay? And I will not explain more because he has very nice contribution. If you would, I invite everybody to read the papers of Marianne if he has not already done. How we will work this? Very simple. We are so much that we need to organize in some way. In the past has worked very well. Marianne will talk during more or less 1 hour, and you can make questions at the end. to organize the questions, the only thing that you need to do is to go to the chat and put question, and your name appear here, and I will give turn to everybody if I can. If I have 200 questions, I think that we will finish before 11 in the night, and I could be very tired. Okay, now I allow Marianne to talk. I don't talk more. Thank you.
Thank you, Juan, for that introduction. Can you hear me? Yes, good. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So thanks for having me today and for letting me talk about a topic that has really defined my academic career. I will say that, like most Americans, my education in Black economic history all the way through college was exceptionally poor. And so I'm learning new history all the time, even kind of building this plane as I fly it. So I'm learning new history even as I've worked in this field for the last 15 or so years. And what I'm going to share with you today is my own conclusions about the narrative, the progress of Black Americans from emancipation through today, how I've sort of assembled all of the research that's been done in economic history to build a narrative of the progress. I want to acknowledge the name in which I'm presenting this. As I read more about Larry Epstein and his contributions to this profession in preparation for today, as a journal editor, I thought, boy, he would have been a great referee. But more seriously, I thought it's a great feeling to be on the upward slope of your career. And of course, this lecture series is named for him and recruits people to speak who are hopefully on the upward slope of their career. And it's such a tragedy when that is cut short. It's a privilege to be able to share my own research in his name. I also noticed the illustrious list of Epstein lecturers who preceded me. A great group. I'm pretty jealous, however, because I noticed that each one of them had their lecture, and then the last sentence in the description was, "This is to be followed by cocktail hour." So you owe me cocktail hour. And I confirmed with Juan earlier, I don't have to do anything else. I just have to show up in London for cocktail hour, and that's it. And so I'm looking forward to doing that sometime in 2021. I had my first shot yesterday. So if I say something confusing, you can assume it's a side effect. All right. So as I said, thank you for having me. And I'm going to start with a broad discussion of income inequality, and I'm going to start in 1865. Why? Well, because prior to the enslavement of Black Americans, prior to that, the enslavement of Black Americans makes it impossible to think about comparing incomes. And Black Americans who were free in 1865 were not representative of the experience of Black Americans overall. I'm also going to limit most of my discussion today to men because women's work is often invisible, and also because I'll show you later that the data strategy here links people through time, and women typically change their name at marriage, making them nearly impossible to track. And so this history is really going to begin with emancipation in the United States in 1864, 1865. And I'll argue, and I think many others have said this, that slavery ends, of course, but it's no panacea. Sharecropping and tenancy arrangements in the Reconstruction years reflected the geography of formerly enslaved Americans, and also their human capital endowments. And the structure of the Southern economy itself was a drag on Black economic progress in this period, as the South overall struggled to catch up with the rest of the country. If we take a measure of average Black income in 1870 and divide by average white income in the United States at that same juncture, you would get a measure of about 0.25. Another way of saying that is that Black men earned about 25 cents on the white man's dollar in 1870. If you made that relative to Southern whites, you would get a substantially larger number, but still it would be clear that Black men were at a substantial disadvantage. So if we start at about 0.25, what happened over the intervening 150 years? In a pure income sense, where do Black Americans stand today relative to their white peers? I want to acknowledge here that I am relying on a set of figures from Bob Margo's EHA address several years ago, now published in the JEH, where he calculates these income ratios for all of these intervening years. And so these data come from Bob. These are not my own data. Many of you on this call won't need this timeline, but some of you will. And please don't assume this is drawn to scale. It surely is not. But I'm going to start in the Reconstruction South, which would have been the immediate legacy of slavery lived by Black men in the United States. In 1865, when slavery ended in the US, formerly enslaved Black Americans were very Southern and they were very poor. But also in 1865, the most famous reparations policy dreamed of, but never fully enacted, was briefly US policy. When General William Tecumseh Sherman completed his famous march across the South, he picked up a trail of freedmen. The group had grown to be several thousand strong by the time he reached Savannah, Georgia in January of 1865, and it was becoming a humanitarian crisis to feed and house this crowd. Sherman needed a way to relocate them safely. He consulted with local leaders, including Black church leaders in Savannah, and they came to a conclusion that Sherman would reallocate lands that had been seized by the Union government to these trailing freedmen. And he issued what's known as Special Field Order Number 15, promising each up to 40 acres of land. He intended to redistribute land that had been confiscated from rebel Confederates to these former slaves. And he started with the territory close to Savannah in and around Edisto Island, Georgia. This has become known as the famous 40 acres and a mule promise. The mule was never, as best we can tell, was never actually enacted, but the 40 acres policy was at least begun. And by June 1865, Union authorities had distributed 400,000 acres of coastal South Carolina land to 40,000 formerly enslaved individuals. Half of the land was in South Carolina, and it was good land. Land confiscated from the Confederacy's most ardent defenders. That land was distributed, as I said, to 40,000 formerly enslaved individuals out of a total of 4 million who were emancipated. Lincoln's assassination in April 15th of 1865 effectively ended land redistribution policy. In August 1865, President Andrew Johnson ordered that Southern whites who pledged their allegiance to the Union and paid their taxes would be returned to their previous land. And most of what had been distributed in land to former slaves was returned to its original owner. You might be wondering about the 1862 Homestead Act, whereby the federal government was transferring land to westward migrants. An incredibly small number of Black Americans participated in this program, in part because moving west was very risky, but also because it was hard. If you were a Southern farmer, learning to farm the plains was going to be a very difficult task. The federal government also began the Southern Homestead Act in this period, whereby they promised to reallocate Southern land, federal land, to formerly enslaved individuals. This also was quite unsuccessful. Ultimately, the land was reallocated to many white farmers, but very few Black farmers. One of the most remarkable archival records from this period is a letter from a formerly enslaved Black man to President Johnson, written from one of the locations in South Carolina where land redistribution had been enacted and then retracted. And I'm going to read this to you. I know it's kind of a long quote, but it's just so powerful. He writes to President Johnson, "Shall not we who are freedmen and have been always true to this union have the same rights as are enjoyed by others? Have we broken any law of these United States? Have we forfeited our rights of property and land? If not, then are not our rights as a free people and good citizens of these United States to be considered before the rights of those who were found in rebellion against this good and just government? And now being conquered, come as they seem with penitent hearts and beg forgiveness for past offenses, and also ask if their lands cannot be restored to them. Are these rebellious spirits to be reinstated in their possessions, and we who have been abused and oppressed for many long years not to be allowed the privilege of purchasing land, but be subject to the will of these large owners? God forbid, land monopoly is injurious to the advancement of the course of freedom. And if government doesn't make some provision by which we as freedmen can obtain a homestead, we have not bettered our condition." This failure to distribute 40 acres on a broad scale is legendary in the story of American inequality, even from very early on. W.E.B. Du Bois says in 1903, "The vision of 40 acres and a mule, the righteous and reasonable ambition to become a landholder, which the nation had all but categorically promised the freedmen, was destined, in most cases, to bitter disappointment. Even today, this legacy looms large. In the United States, our current reparations discussion, although I will have relatively little to say about it, is sometimes framed as, what would 40 acres be worth today? And maybe that's how much we owe Black Americans as reparations for slavery. The shadow of this rescinded decision looms large even still. And we'll come back to this point at the end of the talk. The challenge in understanding the Reconstruction period, the years between emancipation in 1865 and 1900 or so, is holding two ideas in tension. Despite the broken promise of redistribution and low relative income of Black men in the immediate post-war years, there are ways in which Southern Black Americans made substantial economic progress after 1865. Home ownership surged. Freedmen were initially somewhat enfranchised politically and on relatively equal footing to whites in terms of school access for children. Patent activity was rising. You can see the homeownership advance in this Collins and Margot figure from their 2011 work. In 30 years, from 1870 to 1900, the racial gap in homeownership fell from a 49 percentage point gap to a 26 percentage point gap as Black Americans moved into homeownership and white Americans moved out. And actually, if you look at this another way, the entirety of the racial convergence in homeownership rates over the past 150 years in our country can be attributed to the period between 1870 and 1900, with little advance in subsequent decades. Another short-term victory for Reconstruction efforts was in the political franchise. The economic history literature has a nice new paper on the successes of local Black politicians in the Reconstruction period, written by Trevon Logan at Ohio State. Indeed, there have been 11 Black Americans elected to the US Senate in our history, but 2 of those were from Mississippi in the 1870s and early 1880s. Those men are Hiram Revels and Blanche Bruce. They're pictured here on either side of Frederick Douglass. There would not be another elected Black senator after these 2 until Edward Brooke in 1967, nearly 100 years later. Can you name the other Black senators from the 20th and 21st centuries? One of them was elected in January, Senator Warnock from Georgia, and the other current sitting senator is Senator Scott from South Carolina. Lisa Cook, a famous economic historian at this point, has contributed to our understanding of Black inventive activity using mined patent data to show that the economic progress of Black inventors really accelerated between 1880 and 1900. Now notice that the scales here are different for white and Black inventive activity. I want to be clear about that. But still, you can see this remarkable growth after 1880, which ends in roughly 1900. Why? Well, Reconstruction efforts held the promise of lots of progress, and I've just shown you evidence of ways in which that progress was bearing fruit. But the effort is short-lived. Funding ends in 1870, troops withdraw by 1877, and things have really turned sour by 1900. The South in particular has enacted voting restrictions through poll taxes and literacy tests. There is school and societal segregation taking hold. Violence, which is the subject of Lisa's analysis, violence through lynchings is really taking hold in the South. There are Black codes and occupational segregation and a rise in penal labor that encourages, at least by some accounts, the incarceration of Black Southerners. So that brings us up to 1900. And if you go back to my relative income slide, depending on your source, you would see that by 1900, Black Americans had risen to roughly 30 or 35% of the income level of their white peers. Okay, so we're going to leave Reconstruction and move into the Jim Crow era, defined here as 1900 through the landmark civil rights legislation of the 1960s. Ultimately, the civil liberties that Black Americans enjoyed during Reconstruction quickly eroded during this Jim Crow period. And by 1900, the South had again become an economically and politically hostile home for Black Americans as civil and economic liberties collapsed on numerous dimensions. Disenfranchisement efforts hit full steam, and various Jim Crow laws served to segregate every interaction imaginable. I have a portfolio of work with co-authors trying to measure how these restrictions affected the outcomes of Black men in particular. Much of my work is in public education. The picture here from the National Archives is of a Black school in the South circa 1920. Although an 1896 Supreme Court decision, the famous Plessy v. Ferguson decision, I did learn about this in school, I do want to say. So Plessy v. Ferguson of 1896 mandated the equal provision of public schools across races. This is the so-called separate but equal requirement. But the facts on the ground indicate that classroom experiences were far from equal from at least 1910 onward. The Supreme Court's ideal was that schools remain segregated but have equal funding. And the facts on the ground were that the schools were separate and insanely unequal. Using self-reported education statistics submitted by Southern states to the federal government, like the one pictured here, my colleague at UT, Celeste Carruthers, and I culled statistics on the annual provision of schooling in white and what were then referred to as colored school districts in the Jim Crow period. This is an example from Alamance County, North Carolina. This is just one page out of this document, but you can see these nicely tabulated numbers detailing how many white and, again, in quotes, colored students there were in these schools, how many teachers there were for white and colored students, and on separate pages, there were also details on how much money was spent overall. And you can see here how much money was spent on these teachers. What's remarkable about these documents is that states were reporting to the federal government in very clear tabulated numbers that they were violating Plessy v. Ferguson. They weren't even trying to hide it. And yet for at least 40 years, no one did anything about it. The ratio of white to Black spending was already stark in 1910 when our data began, and it grew substantially through 1940. The vertical line here represents 1920, and it's evidence that the passage of the 19th Amendment in the United States, which secured women's suffrage, also served to boost expenditures on white schools in particular. If you know your gender economics, you know that women tend to have higher preferences for public goods, including education. What you may have conjectured is that this preference for public goods happens to be race specific. And so when the United States extended suffrage to women, they largely did that to white women, and white women responded by demanding that local school districts spend more money on white schools. In the US last year, we celebrated 100 years of women's franchise, but there's an asterisk on that for me for this reason. The Jim Crow disenfranchisement of Black women and Black men meant that when women's suffrage came around, the growth in spending on public education raised the relative funding for white to Black students from a 3-to-1 gap in 1910 to a 5-to-1 gap by 1940. So both before and after the 19th Amendment, there's a stark quality difference in Black and white schools in the South. Our research also addresses how much this mattered. We took the information on the county school quality in every Southern county and associated it with labor market outcomes in 1940 for the men who were educated in those counties. By 1940, the ratio of Black to white incomes had risen from 25% in 1870, as we've been talking about, to roughly 40% nationwide. But it's almost 50% if you look just at Southerners. That's the 48 or 47% you see in the green bars here. Then Celeste and I estimate what earnings would look like if schools had remained segregated but been funded equally. That's the blue bar. Black incomes would have been 68 to 74% of white incomes in 1940, instead of the 47 to 48% that we observe. That's the bad news. The good news, of course, is that the Jim Crow era was followed by an era of desegregation of Black schools so that funding gaps became less stark. After the Brown versus Board of Education decision, Supreme Court decision in 1954, school resources for Black and white students converged quite quickly, and there was no discernible difference by 1965. The level of Black schooling also rapidly converged on white levels after 1955 or so. Like so many things in economics, even the desegregation of schools movement had its drawbacks and its unintended consequences. Give women the right to vote, make funding inequalities worse. And now desegregate schools, send a whole generation of Black school teachers into unemployment. 25% of Black teachers in the United States lost their jobs in the school integration process. Prior to Brown, as much as 50% of public education teachers in the US were Black, in the US South were Black. After that, many Black teachers lost their jobs and many new teachers did not enter the profession who otherwise would have. Today, the share of America's teachers who are Black is closer to 7% compared to 14% of America's students who are Black. Whatever the faults of the Jim Crow South, and there were obviously many, the South was still in the mid-1900s a poorer, less urban, less industrialized region of the country. And as long as Black men remained concentrated in the South, their incomes would never converge on the average white Americans, no matter what sort of civil liberties they were afforded. And so, as you might have guessed, the Great Migration is an important part of the study of racial income convergence. By 1950, just over 60% of Black Americans lived in the South, compared to 95% in roughly 1900. The massive movement of Southern Blacks to the North has fascinated economists for decades. You can see here the patterns these men took. Isabel Wilkerson has a fabulous book called The Warmth of Other Suns, which follows one family through each of these three colored corridors. My own family from Mississippi, although white, followed that same purple corridor to Chicago in the 1960s as well. There was a white migration in the US. It was just much smaller than the Black migration. The narrative of the Great Migration had long been, prior to Bill Collins' seminal work, had long been that Black Southerners got sick and tired of being treated poorly and left. And now there may be some truth in that narrative, but it isn't really the whole story. Like most mass migrations, the Great Migration was an economic story. World War I had resulted in an almost complete stoppage of incoming immigrants from Europe, and Northern factories were desperate for workers who might be willing to work for those low immigrant wages. The answer was Southern Black workers. Northern factories recruited Southerners like mad, and once that had started, it was impossible to stop. It's not that there wasn't discrimination in the North. Isabel Wilkerson's book has some really heart-melting stories about the discrimination that these families faced, even in the North. But it was the case that incomes and relative incomes were simply much higher. In terms of the income effects of the Great Migration, economists have long thought that the income returns were likely to be massive, but estimating how massive was hard. Right? So very simply, if I observe a group of Southern-born Blacks in Chicago in 1950 with incomes 50% higher than the incomes of Black Americans who were living in Atlanta, it would be unwise to conclude that the return to Northern migration is 50%. You have to worry a lot about selective migration, that the Great Migration somehow was cream skimming, that those who moved to the North were more skilled and therefore earned higher wages than those who didn't move, which would serve to bias your estimates of the income effects of the Great Migration. The elegant solution to this problem, pioneered by Northwestern's Joe Ferry, is census linking. Ancestry.com has been instrumental in building data for economic history research. And Ancestry has transcribed and digitized the data and then generously allowed us to use it. So here's how it works for thinking about the Great Migration. You can start with a group of people in 1910 before the migration begins. The census here, and this is pretty indicative of census takers' handwriting. I'm not sure why there wasn't a handwriting screening when they were hiring enumerators, but clearly there was not. So you start with a group of people in 1910, and the census will tell you where they live and what occupation they have. And you can convert that to some estimate of their pre-migration income. And then you can use census linking technologies to trace these people 20 years later in 1930 or 30 years later in 1940, when many of these men will have moved to the North, but some of them will have stayed in the South. And then you can use these data to understand both the pre and post migration incomes of people so that you can see whether the Great Migration is just cream skimming the South or whether it actually induces higher earnings. What we learned from this exercise, so Bill Collins and I worked on this paper together, and what we learned from this exercise was that there really wasn't any cream skimming in the Great Migration. It was such a massive movement of people that whether you add controls for pre-migration characteristics or don't, it doesn't really make much difference. Overall, moving to the north resulted in an increase of incomes for these migrants of roughly 60%, and that's net of cost of living. That makes the Great Migration a very important part of income convergence for Black Americans in this period. Okay, so that narrative really brings us up to 1960, right on the eve of the Civil Rights Act. Taking a step back, you can see that it took the United States 90 years to go from an income ratio, a relative income ratio of 0.25 to a relative income ratio of 0.46. That really is an excruciatingly slow rate of progress. And so the next question is whether the civil rights era will be any better. The nice thing about moving into the civil rights era is that there's just so much more data. First, I'm showing you the results from a 1963 survey of Black Americans. And the question asks, which do you think is most important to work for now? Right? And you have all of these options. Is it housing discrimination? Is it better schools? Is it voting rights? Is it public accommodation? Or is it equal employment opportunities? And you can see that far and away, the language of equality in the 1960s is about employment opportunities. In Reconstruction, the story is about land. In the 1960s, it's about employment. Just to highlight how hard the battle for equal employment was going to be, this figure shows you the response rates to a number of racial discrimination questions from 1956 through roughly 2010. You can see that nationwide, even in 1964, a majority of Americans thought neighborhoods should or could be segregated. And a majority thought that there should be a law against interracial marriage. A majority thought that Blacks should not push where they're not wanted. By the way, the rate who agreed with that last statement was still 40% in 2003 in this country. Despite these prejudicial attitudes in the general population, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed by a wide margin. 70% of legislators in the federal government voted for it. For all its controversial content, it ended up being relatively uncontroversial, at least by today's American voting standards. The Civil Rights Act had several titles relevant to income inequality. It established desegregation of public and private facilities, including a full desegregation of public schools. The equal employment clauses are perhaps the most famous part of the act, as I'll discuss on the next slide. But the CRA itself was followed by the 1965 Voting Rights Act, establishing protections on voting, and the Fair Labor Standards Act in 1966, which extended the minimum wage to new industries and established overtime rules. More on that in just a minute. The Civil Rights Act explicitly addressed the economic and labor market experiences of Black Americans, and it rendered illegal any discrimination in hiring, firing, or pay. And so this language, if you're an American or have been through the American employment system, this language will be very familiar to you, right? It shall be unlawful to fail or refuse to hire or to discharge any individual as a result of their race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Now, what's true about Americans is that we need to make sure we carve out at least one group to discriminate against, okay? And so for the Civil Rights Act, that group was communists. If you keep reading in the Civil Rights Act, it outlaws discrimination on the basis of all of these categories that I just read, unless an individual is the member of the Communist Party, in which case all forms of discrimination are still legal. And as far as I know, this remains true to today. The evidence we have on the effectiveness of the Civil Rights Act indicates a remarkable change in the economic fortunes of Black workers, both male and female. This figure shows the employment shares of Black men and women and white men and women in one of the most racially segregated industries in the United States, textiles. The specific data here are from South Carolina, the real heart of the Southern textile industry, but the results across the South are likely to be the same. You can see that prior to 1965, there's essentially no Black employment in the textile industry. Those who show up here as positive employment numbers, if you go back and read the narrative of these places, they were employed as outside groundskeepers. But you can also see here that after 1965, there is a marked change in the racial composition of textile industry employees. The private sector responded to the Civil Rights Act, and so did the public sector. There was a real explosion of Southern Black public sector employment after 1965. The public sector was expanding, and Black workers were getting many of those jobs, so that by 1980, more than 25% of Black workers in the South were employed by the government. These patterns can be attributed to the Voting Rights Act. Even in state and local governments that didn't think they would be held accountable by the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act made politicians and governments accountable to Black voters. And that political power, Black voters translated into economic opportunities. The Voting Rights Act also equalized public expenditures across locations. Spending on schools and public services grew in majority Black districts after the VRA was implemented. And again, this contributes to the growth of Black employment in the public sector. Finally, the Fair Labor Standards Act contributed to better outcomes for Black workers. This figure shows you in blue the existing federal minimum wage for the original minimum wage sectors: manufacturing, transportation, communication, wholesale, fire, mining, and logging. And in 1967, many other industries joined this list, including restaurants, public schools, hotels, laundries, services. Adding these services industries to the list of minimum wage industries was hugely important for wage inequality, maybe especially among women, because Black women and men were far more likely to be employed in the industries that had been excluded from the minimum wage prior to this point. So where did all that civil rights progress leave us? This figure sums up well our unfortunate history. There's steady, slow progress that is outsized after 1940 and outsized again in a big way after the Civil Rights Act. But by 1980, we have sort of returned to trend, and that slow convergence continued through 2000. Since 2000, this curve in relative income in the United States is effectively flat. You can see the results of that flatlining of growth in public opinion surveys. There's a question on the Gallup survey that's been asked in the United States for many years now. It says, in general, do you think that Black people have as good a chance as white people in your community to get any kind of job for which they are qualified, or don't you think they have as good a chance? These results from Gallup suggest that from the perspective of Black Americans, the amount of economic injustice in the labor market in 2020 is close to their sentiment in 1963, before the US passes all of the laws I just talked about. And they're closer to those 1963 sentiments than to say this, than, for example, the sentiments that prevailed among Black Americans in the 1990s. Even white Americans are increasingly pessimistic that American labor markets are providing equal opportunity. So what I want to do now is I want to take a deeper dive into two papers that I have at least been a co-author on that I think really address this history and help us understand what's happening. The first one is going to answer the question, is the story I just told you, okay, of very slow income convergence through 2000 and then relatively flat relative income growth after that, is it really a story about race? So here's a thought experiment. Suppose at the end of the Civil War, there was a group of landless Americans located in rural America or even the rural South, not able to read or write, with parents who are also illiterate and provided little in the way of public education. Okay, so, and suppose further that those individuals were white. Would it have taken 150 years for the descendants of this group of Americans to reach an average income of 65% of the national So what we're going to do, Bill Collins and I are going to do in this paper, is we're going to compare the experiences of Black and white sons of similarly situated fathers. We're going to, in other words, hold class fixed and vary race. And the question then is, does race still matter once we control for starting economic position? We can't do this without some pretty substantial data construction. I'm not going to bore you with the details of that. But basically what we're going to have to do is build new intergenerational pairs using census linking, fathers and sons connected to each other for the earliest periods in US history. So we're going to start in 1880, and we're going to build these intergenerational pairs through 1930. After that, the federal government collects enough data that allows us to perform a similar exercise for cohorts born or cohorts observed all the way through 2010. All right, so I'm going to start by showing you what the data say for 1880 fathers and their 1900 sons. All right, the image I'm showing you here is how the ranking of Black and white fathers in 1880 translated into the income ranks of their sons in 1900. The black dots are Black father-son pairs, and the red dots are white father-son pairs. If you take a vertical line on this chart, that will give you a particular father's ranking. So for example, the line I've drawn represents fathers at the 20th percentile of the income distribution, and the associated black dot says that Black sons of these fathers fall at roughly the 15th to 20th percentile on average. White sons of fathers at that same point in the income distribution fall at roughly the 50th percentile. If you think about rising from post-emancipation poverty, you can see that having a poor father who was Black was a far worse predicament than having a poor father who was white, resulting in a difference in expected sons outcomes of about 25 percentiles of the national income distribution on average. That estimate, that 25 percentage points estimate, is impervious to controls. So it doesn't matter if I control for the specific locations in which Black sons were living, doesn't matter if I control for the literacy of their parents or anything else I can observe about their households, it's still the case that on average, Black sons land 25 percentile points below white sons of equivalent fathers' rank. Now I'm going to fast forward and show you what this looks like through time. Okay, so we're going to kind of move through American history here. The next slide is going to be for 1910 fathers and then their sons observed in 1930. You can recall that this is the Jim Crow era, and the pattern here looks very similar. White sons exceed substantially the rankings of Black sons at every point in the father's income distribution. The next slide is going to move into the more modern period using federal data. I'm going to be able to observe 1950 fathers and their 1962 sons. So on the eve of the Civil Rights Act, have we made any progress in relative intergenerational mobility? The answer is not really. Things appear slightly better at the higher end of the income distribution, but there aren't that many Black fathers who start in that position, okay? And so really what dominates the average numbers here is what's happening now, and things don't appear to be much better. The same survey observes fathers in roughly 1960 and their sons in 1973, so right after the Civil Rights era. And so here you can see the clouds are getting a little bit closer, but they're still entirely separate clouds. It's still the case that being a Black son is a far worse predicament than being a white son. What about the modern era? We have a data set of fathers in 1979 and their children in 2000. So not quite all the way to today, but getting there. Right. Here again, the samples appear to be overlapping somewhat more substantially, although still not at the lower end of the income distribution. And again, our estimates for these years indicate that Black sons on average fall 20 percentile points below white sons. If we do the same analysis for sons in 2010, we get almost an identical. So the conclusion of this work has been that sons of low status white fathers have had far higher incomes than those of similarly situated Black sons throughout US history. We do some calculations in the paper that suggest that these differences in mobility are the primary driver of income inequality today. And there's no reason to believe that the slow progress of Black Americans is an issue of class. It appears to be entirely an issue of race. The second paper I want to talk about is information. Okay, so and only a fool would stand up in a Zoom lecture that's being broadcast across 7 continents to people I don't even know and share results from preliminary work. But that's what I'm going to do because I'm excited about it and I want you to be able to see something new. Some of you have seen parts of this presentation before. So I'm going to show you some new work, again with Bill Collins and also his graduate student, Nick Holtkamp, where we're trying to understand the wealth inequality. All right, so let me go back and just say, we're still learning about racial wealth inequality in American history. The research here is extraordinarily new and it's evolving, okay? So there really is just very little information about wealth holding among Black and white Americans in the past. What we do know is that if today's kind of per capita Black to white income ratio is about 65%, the per capita ratio in wealth in the US is more like 10%. So we know that wealth is, in general, a much more unequal thing than income. What we don't understand really is the history. These last numbers that I just read to you, the 10% figure, is one of the primary drivers of our current reparations discussion. Should the federal government allocate capital to Black households to close the wealth gap? By some arguments, this is an act we should take precisely because Johnson reversed Lincoln's decision 150 years ago, and we didn't get the original 40 acres plan that perhaps we should have. So the way Bill and Nick and I are thinking about this is that there's $1 million question. Would racial inequality be different today if the 40 acres policy had stuck? Now, I'm not suggesting that if the answer to this question is no, that we should abandon reparations policy in the US. That's not what I'm suggesting. But I do think it's instructive to think about what a large-scale wealth infusion can correct and what it cannot correct. So that's the purpose of this paper. So we're trying to make progress on this question about wealth infusions by examining the intergenerational transmission of economic status in the Reconstruction years. We're looking at Black households that have accumulated land by 1880 and those that have not, right? And thinking about how that land accumulation affected or did not affect the outcomes of their children, right? So what happened to the kids of adults who had accumulated, Black adults who had accumulated land in 1880? Were they better off than the children of landless Black farmers? Okay, so to do this, what we're going to have to do, so this is for the data junkies on the call. So what we're going to have to do here is we're going to need to look at information in the agriculture census of 1880 to be able to make any progress. So we're going to link the population census, which tells us what occupation the father has and also what race the father is. And we're going to link that to the agriculture census, which we think is a reasonably thorough expression of land ownership among Americans, especially in the South at this point. And in that agriculture census, we're going to be able to observe for every Black and white farmer in the South how much land they own and how much that land is valued at. Okay, so how many acres do you have and what is it worth? And then the idea is that we're going to trace them and connect them to their sons 20 years later and see how their sons fare as a function of their father's land ownership. So our very early results suggest that in 1880, an extraordinarily small number of Black farmers owned 40 acres or more. And really very few owned land at all. On the other hand, 46% of white farmers owned more than those proverbial 40 acres. So to own 40 acres as a Black father in 1880 would have been an extraordinarily rare occurrence. So what happens to the sons of Black landowners? How much did this acreage ownership matter? Like I said, only a fool would share such preliminary results, but I'm going to go ahead and do that. bear with me as I show you this. So this is the extensive margin of the results. All right, so let me just orient you for a second. The red dots here are going to reflect Black sons. The blue dots here are going to reflect white sons. I'm showing you the intensive margin of our results, but the extensive margin effectively look the same, right? So I'm just gonna, like, for example, let me show you this top left-hand corner. The outcome we're interested in here is, what is the income rank of the son? How does the son line up in the national income distribution as a function of how much land their father owned 20 years prior? And what you can see is that, you know, again, if you're a white son, for any given acreage, if you're a white son, you end up much ahead in the national income distribution. But there also doesn't appear to be any slope in the line of best fit here, right? So it's not the case that being a substantial landowner, so for example, if you owned 100 acres or 150 or 200 acres, it doesn't appear to have bought your child anything in the national income distribution 20 years later. It's true on the intensive margin and it's true on the extensive margin, meaning comparing landowning fathers to non-landowning fathers. The positive numbers to the zeros generate similar conclusions. You can see here that if you look at the probability that your son was a laborer, so that's the bottom of the kind of occupational ladder, you can see some slope here. So the higher the acreage value of fathers, the less likely it is that their son end up as laborers. But it's also true that the higher the acreage, the less likely it is that the son ends up in manufacturing, which is a relatively lucrative position at this point. The bottom two quadrants here, or the bottom two frames here, are the things I really want to emphasize. We do observe in these data a strong positive relationship between the ownership status of fathers and the ownership status of their sons. So even if land ownership among fathers did not bring labor market successes to their sons, that ownership of fathers does appear to have translated into land ownership among their sons. And it also appears to have translated into higher literacy for Black sons, not for white sons. We have much more work to do here, but I wanted to share these preliminary results. Our conclusions so far suggest that there's little change in labor market success for the sons of landowning fathers when they're observed in 1900. There's not an observable upgrade in their occupation status. They're somewhat less likely to be an unskilled laborer, but it's not a large difference. On the other hand, as I said, sons of landowners are more likely to own their own home, which is our best measure of wealth accumulation in the next generation. Having a father who is a landowner doubles the probability that a son owns their own home. And Black sons' literacy is positively correlated with fathers' land ownership. All right, let me just finish up by saying that our results so far indicate labor markets were relatively impervious to wealth accumulation. And I think that gives us the right frame on which to think about what might have happened had we had a full 40 acres reallocation in the United States. Would it have solved our wealth inequality problem? Perhaps, but there's no indication that the change in land ownership would have affected labor markets, and therefore no indication that it would have changed the distribution of income itself. Now, I'm going to try not to do the famous thing that economists do and say on the one hand and on the other hand, but I really have to. Let me just say this, all right? The way Bill and Nick and I are thinking about these results is this is a partial equilibrium story. I'm telling you what happens to the sons of Black landowners in the South in 1880 using the small share of Blacks who had accumulated land by 1880 to tell that story. If all freedmen had been granted land, things may have been very different. Okay, so on the one hand, it could have been that the political economy of the South would have been much more favorable to progress, including in labor markets, if all freedmen had been landowners. On the other hand, if all freedmen had been granted land, you can imagine a scenario in which the resistance to Black land ownership would have been much more potent, and that there would have been no progress in labor markets even still. our next steps on this project, and then I'll wrap up, our next steps on this project are to try to discern between these two possibilities by really understanding the mechanisms by which the success of Black fathers in 1880 was or was not passed on to their sons. So for example, did Black sons fare better in the labor market in locations where Black schools were better, or in locations where there were many Black landowners and not just single or solitary landowners in a location? We think understanding the mechanisms of intergenerational transmission of both wealth and then of labor market status will help us understand the true scope of the counterfactual. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and then my understanding is that Juan's going to manage questions.
Okay, thank you, Marianne. Really exciting and very new. Joel is the first one.
Hello, Marianne. Remember me? So here's my question. You made a statement that it really was race and not status or anything. And I was wondering if you could dig a little bit deeper and ask what exactly was it about race that led to these things? And one thing that occurred to me is, was it some legacy of slavery? And there's a way of testing that, of course, by teasing out the people who were already freedmen before 1860 and see if what you're finding applies to them as well, or whether they had a very different fate. And so it was the ex-slaves rather than the freedmen. The alternative would be that it was something about American society that just systematically discriminates against Blacks, whether they had been slaves in 1860 or not. And I wonder if there's a way of putting that to the test.
It's a great question. There have been some attempts recently, and I want to make sure I don't speak out of turn. There have been some attempts recently to write down an empirical strategy that would exploit something similar to what you're suggesting. So looking at people who were just too young to have been enslaved versus those who were actually enslaved as young children, or perhaps a more extreme version of that is comparing freedmen to former slaves. I have not seen an executed version of that with a convincing strategy that you could put forth. I think the challenge is that slavery affects not just the slave but the community, right? And so if your story is that free Blacks were not affected by slavery, I think that's not correct. They weren't affected on their side of the relationship, but the economy overall obviously is affected. I think that my own personal conclusion about this literature and about the graphs that I showed you today is that what is it about race? It's racism, right? It is about a community and a labor market's response to skin color. And then and I didn't show you these details today, but when you look at these intergenerational mobility coefficients on that Black indicator, so how much further behind are Black sons relative to white sons, as you start adding things you can observe, it doesn't move at all, right? It's not that it's not the residual after you've added a bunch of controls that mattered. It's that the controls don't even make that much difference. And now, granted, we can't observe a ton of stuff in 1880 and 1910, and so there's a lot of stuff we might want to see that we can't. But the fact that the things we do see don't matter would indicate, in a sort of Oster-style argument, would indicate that the rest of the stuff didn't matter either. So that may be not a fully satisfying response to your question, but I think that's the way I'm thinking about it.
Thank you. Ivanka?
Hi, I didn't realize it would be my turn so soon. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah.
Awesome. All right. Hi, Professor Wanamaker. I am a recent graduate of the master's program at LSE. Huge admirer of your research. I'm really excited to see the new research that you have coming out. I have like 8 questions for you, so I'm not going to ask all of them, obviously, but I'm going to try to tie them all together. So what I especially appreciate about your research is how it shows sort of the interaction between political factors as well as economic factors as well as social, cultural, and intellectual attitudes. I think one thing that I found most illuminating was like the Great Migration and how we saw this convergence in income, mostly as a result of, Northern demand for relatively cheap wage workers. And I had moved to Cleveland immediately after studying in the South for my undergrad, and was surprised to see how the narrative was very much, we were progressive and we were accepting and we're the North, and that's why, we're on the right side of history on this. So I would love to hear your perspective on what you hope or what you anticipate the impact of your research will be on how we sort of balance the importance of economic versus political versus intellectual and social factors in this history. Thanks.
That's a great question, a really hard question. Let me say this. I think one thing that you can conclude from the body of literature that I shared today is that even gigantic movements by the federal government, like you had in Reconstruction and like you had in the 1960s, don't solve the problem. And more specifically, that Americans figure out a way to work around the constraints that the government put on them to exercise the social order that they have in their heads. Okay, so that's one way of saying it. In other words, the problem is people. The problem is how people behave, right? And the behaviors that they bring to labor markets, into politics, and to many other things. And so I think my own personal reaction to having spent 15 years in this literature is that there's only so much, there's only so much I can direct at policy. There's only so much I can say to a policymaker. And the more important thing, the more important way for me to spend my time is talking to people, not economists, not policymakers, but people that I live with. I mean, I live in the South, and it's I feel like it's my responsibility as somebody who cares about these issues to not spend all of my time just writing papers and talking to people who think like I do, but instead talking to a wider group of people and trying to build a broader understanding. So that's a little bit of a wishy-washy answer, but I do think it's, I gave a talk a few weeks ago to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau in the federal government, CFPB, for Black History Month, and I gave them a shortened version of this presentation, and I gave the same answer to a question at the end of the session. And the person who asked the question unmuted and said, "That is so depressing, because as you know, I work for the federal government, and my job is to build racial equality in the United States. And what you're effectively saying to me is that I can't do it at work. I have to go do it somewhere else." And that is kind of what I'm saying, right? I mean, it's not that the government doesn't matter at all, but the story, if you put all of the pieces together from the American story, what you learn is that the government can do things in the short run, and then in the long run, we find a way around them to kind of go back to the inequality that we prefer, I guess is a way of saying it.
Thank
Great
you.
question.
Elise, Rotella.
Oh, thank you. Marianne, I'm going to try to bring in two other scholars who I don't think are here, Lee Alston and Rick Steckel, who are, okay. Well, for Lee, I'm thinking about his work on the interactions between Blacks and whites in the postbellum South, in which Blacks needed to live under the protection of white landowners in order to be safe, and I'm not sure where that fits in, but I just wanted to put that one on the table. And then I just listened to I'm sure all of you have been listening to the economic history podcasts coming out of Ireland, but Rick Steckles is the most recent one that I've listened to, and he argues that people came out of slavery because of the feeding practices and under which they had lived, that with fewer opportunities within themselves to thrive, and that it took a generation or two maybe even 3 for those disadvantages associated with the conditions under slavery to dissipate? That's not exactly a question. I'm just throwing it on the table for you.
This is good. My answer is going to be I have to think harder about both of those things. So, responding to Lee, to your point about Lee Alston, I will say that you make decisions in a research project early on that sometimes you regret. And one of the things we regret about the way we have done this sampling of the agriculture census is that we didn't do a clustered sample. So I just have a random smattering of Black farmers and a random smattering of white farmers, and I don't observe, at least at the moment, I don't observe neighbors. So I can't look at, who's your neighbor, who are you likely working with, what might the relationship here be between these farmers that are listed consecutively in the ag census. We didn't build this sample that way, and it was an extraordinarily costly sample to build. So whether we'll go back and do that, I don't know. But it's going to limit our ability to answer questions about peer effects, except we're going to be able to use the 1870 census to say something about where Black ownership is relatively concentrated, but that's about it. So I don't have a great answer to that. On Steckel's comment, I haven't thought about it, but I will say that one way of interpreting the lack of kind of transmission from landowning fathers to their sons in the labor market might be a sort of reversion to the mean. That there may have been some formerly enslaved individuals who came out of slavery with more human capital than others in a more literal sense, like Rick is discussing. And therefore, it's those people who ended up accumulating land. They were stronger and healthier, and so they could work the land more fully, and they were the ones who ended up accumulating land. And that in that next generation, that those inequalities in health status had sort of evened out, and that would explain a lack of transmission, right, in labor market outcomes. So again, I haven't thought about it very completely, but I'm glad you mentioned it because it is one way of explaining what we're seeing.
Thank you. Ken?
Oh, thank you, Chair. Thank you so much, Marianne. I have 2 questions. One, in your early data set, you show a shining moment around 1900, during which the Black patent performance will outperform the whites in more or less a zero-sum kind of a game. So I wonder why and how the Black inventors didn't perform any better further on in terms of social mobility. Secondly, your story, if we still believe in Arthur Lewis, this dualism and neoclassical sort of a free market, I wonder whether political freedom really is some sort of a non-monetary payment to the Black sort of population. Otherwise, why you have this consistent sort of a discount rate to pay the Black population? It doesn't make any sense if we still believe in neoclassical economics. Thank you.
Okay, I did not follow fully the second question, so I'm going to ask you to restate that one. Let me address the first one. So first, I want to say, to be clear on that patent graph, the scales are different by multitude. So the Black patent activity is still a very, very small share of white patent activity, even on per capita basis. So I want to be clear about that. What Lisa Cook says, and you can listen to Econ History Podcast, or you can listen to Planet Money and pick up Lisa Cook. But what she says, argues in that paper, which I think is in the Journal of Economic Growth, is that the patent activity falls off when political violence takes hold in the South, and that political violence has spillovers into human capital, and into let me just say inventive activity, right? And it's a marvelous paper, and so I'll just refer you to that. So tell me again what your question is about political freedom.
I wonder whether the consistent sort of a short pay to the Black generation by generation workers really is a major violation of neoclassic economics. Yeah, So because if you have sort of a transparency in the market and the market clears itself, why you pay your Black fellow workers low? I wonder whether freedom has a sort of non-monetary payment component in their actually salaries or wages, I wonder.
It reminds me of a Joel Mokyr quote from an economic history seminar when I was still at Northwestern, where he said, "It works in practice, but will it work in theory?" Right? So we've long had this theory in our head that there can't be discrimination because we write down a model where there can't be discrimination, and then the empirics suggest there's discrimination, and then we say, well, I can't imagine how there could be discrimination. So I think I think you just from a theoretical perspective, right, you can get to market discrimination with small changes to the neoclassical model, right? And in particular, you can get a whole lot of labor market discrimination if every employer is discriminatory, right? Then that in and of itself. And so if you think about what's happening in 1880 in the South, right, you've taken all the political power away from Black Americans, you've taken all economic power away from Black Americans, and the employer here is a white employer, and there's no migration. And so it doesn't take much to generate a model where discrimination can survive.
Thanks.
Rita, please. Rita Stuti.
Hi, it's actually Sean Epstein. I'm not an economist or a historian, so maybe I'm missing something obvious, but when you showed the your charts of father to son transfer, and you have the trend lines superimposed, it seems that you have very broad, wide sampling of the fathers all the way from 0 to the 100th percentile. And then when it comes to the sons, they're very narrowly distributed. I wonder if you could just explain how that's happened.
Yeah. Let me unpack those figures. By the way, thank you for being here. It's an honor that you're here. We've been back and forth with the editor on this paper about what that figure should look like. One thing I didn't say is that those circles, when you see a father's particular point in the income distribution, if you were to add weights to say, well, how many fathers are represented at this point in the income distribution, what you would see for Black fathers is that although we observe many fathers all the way out on the income distribution, it's very few relative to the number of fathers that we observe, Black fathers, that we observe at the low end of the income distribution. So one thing we could do and have done is make those circles reflective of how many people are represented by them, and then you'll see very large circles on the left-hand side of those slides and very small circles on the right-hand side of those slides. On the vertical dimension, which is measuring sons' outcomes, we're just taking an average of all sons who have a father at that particular point in the income distribution. So if we had a full sample, there would be exactly 100 or 99 dots right on that figure, and they would represent bins of each point in the income distribution for fathers. What's the average outcome of their sons? So if I plotted the actual data, it would be super messy because there are sometimes 30,000 individuals in that sample, but we're just giving you the average value for sons. It's a great question. I should have oriented those better.
So you're basically showing, as you said, a reversion to the mean.
We're showing an average outcome for sons, but the point is that for a given, if you take a given point in the income distribution of fathers, so let's say it's the 20th percentile, you average the outcomes of all sons of Black fathers at that point. You average the outcome of all sons of white fathers at that point, and those are the two data points that are on that figure. And then if you start controlling for other things, so let me adjust these by all the other stuff that we might think matters, it doesn't change very much. So even if I control for literacy of the parents, or the part of the country they live in, or whether they're rural or urban, whether they own their own home, I don't see much change.
Lee, please.
Yeah, thanks, Marianne. I'm going to ask two questions that may be impossible to answer, sorry, but I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on them. The first is kind of building off of what you said about the kind of inability of the federal government to sort of exert lasting change. And I'm wondering if this is about a sort of time horizon issue, in that in all of the sort of policy interventions you talked about, yeah, there's a sort of not too long after they're put into place, there's a change of regime or change of party in power or whatever, and things immediately kind of come under attack. So I'm wondering if people kind of factor that into their behavior, the idea that these things aren't going to last, and so they don't kind of fully absorb them, and if there's any way around that, or whether that sort of political cycle doesn't help in sort of facilitating the sort of change. And then the second question, and this is a really unfair one because your whole presentation is on the US, so I'm going to ask you about not the US, but other places, since I saw you give part of this in South Africa, I feel like I can maybe ask this. Other places have dealt with similar issues about redistribution and kind of had similar shocks, right? South Africa being one of them, right? Where you have massive racial inequalities and some effort, arguably not a very successful effort in some ways to deal with them. And I'm wondering if the US kind of history offers any lessons, good or bad, for other places that are dealing with more recent transitions.
It's a great question. Let me start with South Africa, which is actually, I want the lessons to go the other way. I think,
bad, right?
I mean, in some ways, we're 150 years into this and we haven't sorted it out. Right. And, you guys are less than that. So when I was in South Africa, I was thinking, gosh, can you tell me what works? Because we haven't figured it out. So I don't know that I have any great insights. I mean, I think I would just point out that the further you get from the initial sin, the harder it is to fix the problem. And so, I guess one lesson from American history is don't wait on this thing to sort itself out. It's not going to. And so you have an opportunity to do something immediate. You had a real opportunity to do something, kind of as soon as liberation, and that would have probably been quite meaningful. 30 years down the road, is it, can you still do it? I don't know. But that's one way of thinking about the lessons. Your other question was about the kind of political time frame. So I'll say that I do think, generically speaking, in the United States, we have a real problem with enacting something and then unenacting it and then enacting it and then unenacting it. That said, most of the things on which we have that problem aren't the fundamental core of what we think addresses racial inequality. So, for example, if you think about everything that's passed in the 1960s, none of that is repealed, and none of it, I don't even think any of it's under threat of really being repealed. There may be some state politics that are kind of wrapped up in that, and people trying to weasel out and from a state perspective. But for the most part, the federal government has been pretty committed to those changes. And so if the story about why the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the Fair Labor Standards Act and all that sort of stuff doesn't seem to have changed our situation substantially in the long term, is about political uncertainty, I guess I'm not convinced. I mean, maybe there's a little bit of that, but I don't think that's the story. I think the story is that employers have found ways around these issues, and that as a society, we've substituted labor market discrimination. We've taken out the labor market discrimination, and we've added other discriminations, including, of course, a large rise in incarceration rates, which, it kind of, you solve one problem and then here comes this other one, right? Yeah, it's a great question.
Alejandra.
Sorry, I'm trying to open the video and the micro. Marianne, thank you very, very much. It's been very clear, and thank you for coming to us. I was wondering, it might be a way to continue the question that Joel put earlier. And the data you have is fantastic, and the envy of anybody working outside the United States. But I was wondering if there is any way to trace what was experienced in the North particularly during the Great Migration. If you can observe or check whether this conversion exists, you show us the very clear differential in income once moving, but is any possibility to compare the trajectory of the people that migrated to the north and, you know, somehow hold constant the fact that these people presumably were more welcoming? So have you tried that or explored it or just as a hypothesis? But thank you anyway.
Only a little bit. I mean, I do think the question of whether, you know, whether the discrimination that people experienced was lessened in the North relative to the South is an open question. I don't want to claim any territory here. I don't know the answer to that. In the relatively small number of instances in my own research where I felt like I could examine this question, I haven't found any difference. So an example would be when Celeste and I looked at how this schooling inequality affects incomes in 1940, we ran those regressions and then we added a dummy for whether you move to the north. Okay, now granted, there aren't that many people in the data set that we were using that had moved to the north, so it's a small sample size, but the basic conclusion was it didn't make any difference where you were, that there's a similar kind of labor market penalty for being Black, conditional on what we can observe in both the South and the North. And that there's no evidence that for example, that Northerners valued the quality of the school you attended any more than Southerners did. We're doing some new work looking at experiences in the 1960s during the Civil Rights Act. And one of the hypotheses we have is that we're kind of looking at earnings histories using Social Security data. So we're looking at year by year what people earned and what race they were and what their education background was and what industry they worked in. So we're trying to untangle, what's the mechanism by which the Civil Rights Act raises incomes? Who does it raise incomes for and where? And so I think at that point, we might be able to say something about whether there's more resistance among employers in the South to equalize pay than there would have been in the North. But I just don't have a great answer for you yet.
No, right, but it would be very interesting to see. Also, if it changed over time in the North as Black population increase, the share increases. But anyway, I look forward to reading that. Thank you very much.
Mileage out of this annual data within a worker. So it's like, it's like effectively a worker's earnings history. And so we're hoping that that's going to allow us to answer some of these questions.
Right, good, thank you.
Eric Snyder.
Thanks very much. This is really fascinating and really great to see all this together. I kind of wanted to push back maybe a little bit on the federal government side, because I think, I don't know, I think you're right that it's really, really hard to understand what the federal government could do in a kind of positive way. But I think it's really, really clear the things that they have done or that have been done to make this worse, right? In terms of redlining, Tuskegee, lots of things that maybe not the Senate and, but like government entities in the United States have really made things worse over the past. So I wonder if you flip that around, do you see that as well? And is that something that the government can do, which is just to stop doing bad things, basically?
Well, yeah, that was going to be my response. Is you're giving me examples of when the government was like overtly racist. And do I think it matters if the government's not overtly racist? Yes, of course, right? And I mean, we wouldn't have written the Tuskegee paper if we didn't think that mattered. And there's this new paper looking at the discrimination in public employment in the Wilson administration that also appears to suggest that the Wilson administration's, racist behavior mattered for labor market outcomes. Yes, absolutely. On the other hand, these are powers that the government has as an employer, as a home lender, as a, almost as a healthcare provider. And so that's a small share of the overall economy, not in home ownership. Let me be clear, the federal government's role in home ownership in this country is gigantic. But in the other senses, right, I mean, I can only do so much as the government. And if I have been and behaved appropriately myself, now the question is, how can the government impact the behavior of private actors? And that's where I'm more pessimistic, that, you know, yes, I agree, the government shouldn't discriminate. And there are ways in which I think there's legislation in front of the state government, Tennessee, for sure right now, and probably in front of the federal government, which you could argue is a discussion about discrimination. Is the government going to be discriminatory? And I'm not trying to downplay that. But I think if our goal is equality, the idea that you get there through the government, I think, is misguided. And that residual 35% in gain is going to have to be about changing people and not just about what the government does.
Andy?
So you talked about minimum wages, and I was a little surprised what you said about there being no appetite for reversal of 1960s policies, because 1967 was really as good as it got for minimum wages. The 67 was the single biggest expansion of coverage, and the real value of the minimum wage, and also relative to average earnings, has been declining really dramatically since 1980. And given this finding that the 67 expansion really did reduce racial inequality, is the converse also true, that the erosion of minimum wages since 1980 has had the opposite effect?
Great question. Good correction. Yes, you're right that it doesn't take a reversal of policy to erode the potency of something. And so inflation and the minimum wage is the perfect example of that. I mean, your question about whether today a heightened minimum wage would be more beneficial for Black workers than white, I think there's evidence that suggests that that's true. I will say that this evidence on the minimum wage in the Fair Labor Standards Act and the paper that has come out of that was recently published at the QJE. There is another paper in the literature, and I'm not going to get into this debate, but there's another paper in the literature that suggests that there wasn't a beneficial effect for Black workers. So that there was enough disemployment from the minimum wage to offset the gains. I will say I'm not sure the conclusions there are completely settled. But you see this same discussion in today's minimum wage discussion, right? That not only should you anticipate some non-employment result from raising the minimum wage, but also, and maybe Andrew, you can share your thoughts on this, but the other thing that people often bring up is that you're also likely raising the cost of consumer goods, and you're raising the cost of goods that may be disproportionately, again, purchased by minority communities, and therefore it's not as clear a home run as you might think it is. My personal, for what it's worth, my personal thought on the minimum wage is that we seem to have distilled the debate in the United States into, if you support the minimum wage, then you support income equality, and if you don't support raising the minimum wage, then you don't support income equality. And I think we've lost the middle ground, which is that I might support income equality and think that the minimum wage is the wrong tool, right? And we've kind of lost that thread in the discussion. Not to hijack this conversation into a minimum wage conversation, but anyway. But yeah, I agree with your comment. It's a good one.
The last question, Gregory Salter, please.
Yeah, thank you. Your opening comparison was 150 years of little progress measured by average income discrepancies between the Black and white communities. It left me wondering whether, given the huge growth of income and wealth inequality since the Reagan-Thatcher reforms, whether a view from a median would actually turn out to show a convergence of Black and white poverties. Not that that's a particularly happy outcome either, but
looking at them, so there's not a ton of work that converts all of this into the median, and I certainly can't generate Bob Margot's slide on the median, but I can say that there's work by Kerwin Kofi Charles and Pat Bayer, who have done a recent analysis about racial income inequality in the United States, thinking about the median. Their motivation for doing so is a little bit different. They're worried about a lot of non-employment, and particularly about incarceration rates. And so they choose the median purposefully because it allows them to not have to make an assumption about the income of people who are incarcerated, except that it's below the median. And so in the patterns that they conclude in that paper are roughly similar to what I showed you today. So I don't think there would be much difference if you looked at it in that way. It's a great question.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you to everybody. Many thanks, Marianne. It has been impressive. It's really incredible. And you know, the department is in depth with everybody and expect in some moment, as early as possible, we can invite to everybody to drinks and something at the Sardinia House or close to there. Thanks a lot. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.